She had been visiting her daughter in the United States every year for 6 years. Same airport, same routine. She would land, smile at the officer, answer a few simple questions, and be in her daughter's arms within the hour. But this time, the officer looked at her passport longer than usual. He typed something. Then he asked her to follow a different line. Not toward the exit, but toward a set of doors that led to a room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. They kept her there for 3 hours. They asked her about money she had received from her son-in-law 2 years ago, a transfer she had completely forgotten about. My name is Sarah, and I have worked inside and alongside the U.S. immigration system for more than 20 years. I have seen this system from every angle, how it is designed, how it actually operates, and how the gap between those two things can catch good people at the worst possible moments. What is happening right now at U.S. ports of entry, the official crossing points at airports, seaports, and land borders, is something I need you to understand before it happens to you or someone you love. I want to start by telling you something that I mean completely. The confusion and the fear that come with border experiences, the not knowing, the feeling of being watched without having done anything wrong, that is one of the heaviest things families in this situation carry. I have sat across from parents who were separated from their children for hours at an airport and could not reach them. I have spoken with professionals who had done everything correctly and still ended up in a secondary inspection room. That experience leaves a mark. And I understand why it makes people afraid to travel, afraid to plan, afraid to hope that the next crossing will go smoothly. But here is what I have also learned in 20 years. The families who came through these moments best, who got through the room and onto the other side, were the ones who were prepared. Not lucky. Prepared. And preparation starts with understanding what is actually happening, which is exactly what we are going to do right now. Let me tell you what is going on at U.S. borders, not the version that gets passed around in community groups, but what is actually changing inside the agencies and why it is affecting travelers who have never had a problem before. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the federal agency known as CBP, which is responsible for overseeing everyone who enters the United States at every official crossing point, has significantly expanded its use of financial record checks as part of the entry inspection process. This means that CBP officers are now more frequently requesting documentation of a traveler's financial history, including bank account records and transaction histories, as part of determining whether to admit someone into the country. The legal basis for this is not new. CBP has always had broad authority at ports of entry to request documents, ask questions, and make admissibility determinations, meaning decisions about whether to let someone in. What has changed is the frequency and depth with which this authority is being used. Officers who previously might have asked a few routine questions are now, in many reported cases, asking to see months or years of financial activity. And this is happening to people with valid visas, with clean travel histories, with no prior issues at the border. Here is the part of the system that most travelers do not understand, and it is the part that matters most. When you arrive at a U.S. port of entry, the legal environment you are standing in is different from the rest of the country. The constitutional protections that ordinarily limit what government officials can ask you, search, or demand from you, those protections apply with less force at the border. Courts have consistently upheld CBP's authority to conduct inspections and request documents at ports of entry under a much lower standard than would apply if you were inside the country. You are not without rights. But you are in a space where the government's authority is at its broadest, and understanding that reality is the first step toward navigating it successfully. What happens when a financial record review is triggered? The officer runs your entry documents through government databases, shared computer systems that pull information from multiple federal agencies. If those systems flag anything, a mismatch between your stated income and a financial transfer on record, a pattern of travel and remittances that the system considers unusual, or a discrepancy between your visa application and your apparent financial situation, you are routed to secondary inspection. That is the room with the plastic chairs. And once you are in secondary inspection, the review becomes more detailed, more documented, and more consequential. And here is what I need you to understand before we go any further, because this is the thing that changes how you prepare. What I keep hearing in the community groups, in the messages people send me, in the WhatsApp chains going around right now, includes some things that are genuinely dangerous to believe. Let me walk through them one by one. The first thing I keep hearing is, this is only happening to people who did something suspicious. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. I wish this were true. I have spoken with doctors, teachers, engineers, and retired grandparents who were pulled into secondary inspection without any prior issue and without any wrongdoing. What triggers a review right now is not always a red flag in the traditional sense. It can be a financial transfer from several years ago that looks unfamiliar to a database, a remittance pattern that the system does not have context for, or simply an officer who asks more questions than the last one did. Having nothing to hide is not the same as being prepared to explain what is in your records. The next thing I need to address is, a valid visa means the U.S. government already approved you. They cannot block you at the border. This is one of the most common and most costly misunderstandings I encounter. A visa is permission from the U.S. consulate, the government office abroad, to travel to the United States and request entry. It is not a guarantee of entry. When you land at the airport, the CBP officer makes a completely separate decision based on what they see in front of them and in the databases about whether to admit you. The consulate and CBP are different parts of the government with different information and different authority. Visa in hand does not mean you walk through automatically. I also keep hearing they only check financial records for people coming from poor countries or countries with banking problems. This is not how the reviews work. Reports of financial record requests have come from travelers arriving from countries across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa, including travelers from wealthy nations with strong banking systems. The review appears to be triggered by patterns in the traveler's profile and record, not by country of origin alone. Assuming your passport protects you from this is a mistake. And the fourth one I hear constantly. If they ask for your phone or your financial records, you just say no. They have no right to that. You do have rights at the border. I am going to talk about those rights in detail in a few minutes. But choosing to refuse a CBP request at a port of entry is a decision with consequences that must be understood in advance, not made in the moment, under pressure, without knowing what happens next. Refusing to provide information or documents can result in being denied entry. That denial goes on your record. It affects future travel. The decision to refuse needs to be made with full knowledge of what it costs, and ideally with legal advice beforehand. Let me now tell you about the hidden traps, the ones that careful, thoughtful, legally compliant people step into because the rules are not posted anywhere that ordinary people would find them. The first hidden trap is the old transfer trap. Many families move money across borders for entirely legitimate reasons, supporting aging parents, helping a sibling start a business, splitting the cost of a family event. Those transfers, even years old, live in financial databases. If you received a large transfer from someone in the United States and you are now applying for or renewing a visa or traveling back to the United States, and that transfer was never explained as part of your visa application, it may generate a question you are not prepared to answer. The explanation may be completely innocent, but if it is not ready, the silence around it becomes the problem. The second hidden trap is the device trap. CBP officers have authority at the border to request access to electronic devices, including phones and laptops. Your phone contains your banking app, your transaction history, your messages, and your contacts. Many travelers do not think of their phone as a financial document, but if an officer opens your banking app and sees transfers that raise questions, you are now in a conversation you did not plan for. Think about what is on your devices before you travel. Speaking with an attorney about legal options, including traveling with a device that does not contain your full financial history, is worth doing before your next trip. The third hidden trap is the inconsistency trap. If the information you provided when you applied for your visa does not match what the officer sees when they look at your travel history, your financial records, or your employment information, that gap becomes a credibility question. Visa applications from years ago are still on record. If your life has changed significantly since your visa was issued, your income, your employer, your family situation, and that change shows up in your records without context, it can look like you provided false information on your original application. It may not be that, but it can look like it. And at a border crossing, appearances matter enormously. The fourth hidden trap is the joint account trap. Some travelers share bank accounts with family members in the United States, a common arrangement in immigrant families where financial boundaries between households are fluid and based on trust. If your account shows large deposits that originated from a U.S. family member, a CBP officer may read that as evidence that you have financial ties to the country that go beyond what a visitor should have. The legal distinction between legitimate family financial support and evidence of intent to remain is not always clear, and at a border crossing, the officer's interpretation carries enormous weight. I want to tell you about someone I will call Farouk. Farouk had a valid tourist visa and had visited the United States 3 times without any issue. On his 4th visit, during secondary inspection, the officer asked him about a wire transfer he had received from his brother-in-law in Texas about 18 months before. The transfer was a loan, a family arrangement, entirely informal for a home repair. Farouk had no documentation of it. He explained it verbally, but the officer noted in the file that the explanation was unverified. Farouk was admitted that time, but when he applied for his next visa renewal, the consulate asked follow-up questions about that same transfer, and he had to provide a signed letter from his brother-in-law explaining it. Something that began as a simple family loan became a 2-year paperwork trail. I share Farouk's story because it is the kind of thing nobody thinks to prepare for until they are sitting in the room. The details are drawn from real situations and do not identify any specific individual. What comes next is the part that actually puts you in control, and I want you to hear every word of it. Let me speak directly to the different groups of people watching this right now because the same general situation lands differently depending on who you are. If you are a parent or grandparent who visits adult children in the United States on a tourist visa and you stay for several months at a time, you are in a category that is receiving heightened attention. Officers are looking at whether the pattern of your visits suggests you may be living in the United States rather than visiting. Have documentation of your ongoing life at home, regular bills, medical appointments, community memberships, anything that shows your roots are where you say they are. If you have been sending money to family members in other countries, which is completely legal and extremely common, have a simple mental record of those transfers, who received them, what they were for, and approximately when. You do not need a file of receipts, but you need to be able to answer the question calmly and specifically if it is asked. If you received money from someone in the United States, a gift, a loan, a share of a family expense, and that transfer appears in your bank history, have a clear, honest explanation ready. If the amount was significant, a brief written note from the person who sent it explaining the purpose is a reasonable thing to carry. If you are a student on an F1 visa, the visa for people enrolled at U.S. colleges and universities, returning from travel abroad, your financial documentation should align with the funding source you reported when you were admitted. If your parents support you, have evidence of that. If it was a scholarship, carry that documentation. A gap between your stated funding and what your bank history shows is exactly the kind of discrepancy that generates questions. If you are a green card holder, a lawful permanent resident, meaning you have the right to live permanently in the United States, who has spent extended time abroad, be prepared to demonstrate that your life is still centered here. Long absences can raise questions about whether you have given up your permanent resident status. This is a specific legal risk that is worth discussing with an attorney before you travel if you have been outside the country for more than 6 months. Here is what to do. Right now, before your next trip, before you book a ticket, before you tell anyone what your travel plans are. First, sit down with your own bank statements from the last 3 to 5 years and look at them the way a stranger would. Note any large transfers in or out, any irregular deposits, any payments whose purpose is not obvious from the description. Write down a plain, honest explanation for each one. Second, gather any documentation that supports those explanations. A message chain, a family letter, a receipt, a loan agreement, anything that turns an oral explanation into something with a paper trail. You do not need to carry all of this to the border, but having it organized means you can produce it quickly if you need to. Third, review the information you provided on your most recent visa application. Make sure your current situation, income, employer, family structure, reason for travel, is consistent with what you reported. If there have been significant changes, talk to an immigration attorney before your next entry. Fourth, if you plan to travel with your phone or laptop, think about what financial information those devices contain and whether you are comfortable with an officer potentially viewing it. Speaking with an attorney about your options before travel is the right move, not something to figure out at the airport. Fifth, if you are pulled into secondary inspection, remain calm, be cooperative, and answer questions honestly. But if at any point you are asked to sign a form, read it completely before signing. You have the right to ask what the document says and what signing it means. You have the right to decline to sign something you do not understand. Sixth, after any border experience that felt unusual, whether or not you were admitted without problem, write down what happened while it is fresh. What was asked, what you said, what documents were reviewed. That record may be important if there are follow-up questions or if you need legal help later. There is something I need to warn you about directly, and I am not going to soften it. There are people operating right now in immigrant communities, advertising online in community Facebook groups, sometimes in person, who are offering to help travelers prepare bank records that will pass border inspection. They call it consulting. They call it document preparation. What they are doing is offering to help you present false financial records at a U.S. port of entry, which is a federal crime. It does not matter how they describe it. If the records are not accurate, presenting them at the border can result in a permanent bar from the United States, criminal prosecution, and consequences that extend to your visa, your family's immigration cases, and your ability to ever return. The people offering these services will be unreachable the moment there is trouble. Do not go near them. I want to tell you about someone I will call Priya. Priya was a professional with a valid work visa who had traveled without incident for years. She was told by someone in her network that a consultant could make sure her financial profile was optimized for border review, presented in the most favorable possible way. She paid for the service. What she did not know was that the consultant had altered the dates and amounts on several of her bank statements. At the border, a CBP officer noticed a discrepancy between what the statements showed and what appeared in a linked financial database. Priya was detained, questioned, and ultimately denied entry. Her visa was revoked. She has not been able to return. I share her story because the cost of trusting the wrong person is not a fine or a delay. It is everything. The details are drawn from real situations and do not identify any specific individual. If you are a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident with a family member who has experienced a border issue, an unexpected secondary inspection, an annotation on a visa record, a denial of entry, the Constituent Services Office of your congressional representative is a resource most people do not know they have. Your congressional representative is your elected member of the U.S. House of Representatives or Senate. Every one of those offices has a constituent services team whose job is to help people in the district navigate federal agencies, including CBP. They can make formal inquiries on your family member's behalf, request information about what triggered a review, and sometimes help move situations that have become stuck in the system. they cannot override legal decisions. But a congressional inquiry creates an official record that someone in authority is paying attention, and that sometimes changes how quickly a case moves. Find your representative at house.gov by entering your zip code. I want to acknowledge something before we close because I think it needs to be said plainly. The experience of not knowing whether your next border crossing will go smoothly, of wondering whether a transfer from 3 years ago, or a trip that lasted a few days longer than planned, or a number that appears in a database somewhere, is going to become the thing that keeps you from your family. That uncertainty is genuinely hard to carry. It disrupts planning. It creates anxiety around things that should feel ordinary, like buying a plane ticket. It makes people feel surveilled when they have done nothing wrong. I am not going to tell you that feeling is not real, because it is completely real. What I am going to tell you is that the way through it is not to avoid the system. It is to understand the system well enough that the system cannot surprise you. Here is what you still control. You have the right to remain silent in response to questions that go beyond confirming your identity and your travel documents, though that choice has consequences at a border crossing that must be understood in advance. You have the right to refuse to sign any document you have not read and fully understood. You have the right to ask what the legal basis is for any specific request an officer makes of you. You have the right, once inside the country, to contact an attorney before answering additional questions. And you have the right to request a written explanation of any denial or adverse action taken against you. These rights are yours. They do not disappear because the environment is more tense than it used to be. Use them as tools. Let me close with something I genuinely believe based on everything I have seen. Immigration policy moves in cycles. I have watched the border tighten and loosen and tighten again over 2 decades. What is happening right now is real, and it is serious, and it requires your attention. But the underlying law, the actual legal structure that governs who can enter, what rights travelers have, and what processes exist for challenging adverse decisions, has not been fundamentally rewritten. What has changed is how aggressively and how broadly the existing rules are being applied. That is important. It means the people best positioned to navigate this environment are not the ones who know the most people or have the most money. They are the ones who understand their own situation clearly and have prepared for the questions that are likely to be asked. I have watched families get through border situations that looked from the outside like they had no way forward. Not because the system became kind, but because they were ready. That is what preparation does. It does not guarantee a smooth crossing. Nothing does. But it gives you the best chance, and in a system this large and this imperfect, a good chance is worth fighting for. If you have a specific situation, a visa category, a travel history, a financial pattern you are concerned about, a past border experience that left you with questions, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. I respond when I can, and the questions that appear most often shape what I address next. Your question may be exactly what someone else in this community needs to hear answered. Travel carefully, prepare thoughtfully, and know that someone who has spent 20 years watching this system up close is paying attention and is going to keep telling you what the agencies will not tell you themselves.